Fullmetal Alchemist's first chapter was published on July 12, 2001 by Square Enix and written and illustrated by Hiromu Arakawa. Before I begin, if you're interested in this series, I highly recommend reading both the first and second chapter before making a decision whether to drop or continue the series. It functions as the first arc and it's a brisk read. I was going to give a brief description of what it is, what the hell this series is, but since I'm reviewing the first chapter anyways, let's move on with the critique, and we'll see how well the manga handles its introduction. Immediately opening with chaos, as we witness a boy freaking out after what appears to be an experiment gone wrong, an omniscient narrator issues us a vague warning at this point. The first page is obviously being used to grab the reader's attention with strong, violent visuals, and I don't mind the use of this per se, but, this can be used to cheaply tease the reader with the promise of excitement to come, merely dangling keys. If this is going to be used now, I would hope that it would influence the way we understand these characters this chapter. Otherwise, you could present any provocative scene out of context and have the same effect. It then cuts to a town where people are listening to a sermon over the radio speaking about the sun god Leto. The boy from earlier and an armored man are introduced, and the latter makes an interesting comment that seems to imply that religion isn't common in this world, or at the very least, not common relative to them. Might be interesting world building for later. Either way, it's made clear to us they aren't familiar with this place through this comedic exchange they have here in the scene on the page 10. I had initially thought it was an extremely odd introduction. Unfamiliar characters, obviously, in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar customs. Thinking it over gave a good opportunity to present exposition naturally through dialogue. We, along with the boy, learn of Father Cornell'S, the founder of Letoism. He introduced religion to this town a few years ago and is as... I lost my mind there.
That happens.
He introduced religion to this town a few years ago and is known to have performed miracles. I mentioned this was a good use of exposition. There we go. I mentioned this was a good use of exposition. To clarify, these details could have been exposited through a text blurb, and the information would have still been conveyed. That's completely fair. But the advantage of presenting it the way it does is that it accomplishes multiple things at the same time. We are presented the information, but we can also observe the citizens voicing their excitement, we can infer the influence that Father Cornell'S has on this town, and we can include the boy's apathy towards religion as well. Scrolling. As the armored man gets up to leave, he accidentally knocks over a radio. The vendor even comments about his bulky armor. Wink wink. This is convenient. The reader will witness the first use of alchemy in the series. I would keep in mind that he uses chalk to draw a symbol before all the parts are collected and alchemy is used to repair the radio. The vendor confuses alchemy for miracles. Maybe a hint for later, huh? Wink wink. Now, we are finally given the names of our characters, last names specifically, the Elric brothers. We can assume the armored one is Alphonse'S Elric based on that first page, and the oldest is a state alchemist. Whatever that means. From the way it's spoken about, we can assume it has a certain level of prestige to the title, and also we can assume he works for the government. We are given the older brother's name now on the next page, Edward Elric, also known as the Fullmetal Alchemist. Another comedic exchange is made as the townspeople innocently confuse Alphonse for his older brother. Wonder why that would be the case. We are briefly introduced to Rose, another follower of Leto. The vendor mentions that she has no family and her boyfriend died a year ago. A couple of citizens allude to Father Cornell'S having the power to bring back people from the dead. There's now new context for the Town'S Fanaticism for the father and Leto and the whole religion in general, despite them only knowing them for about a few years, if Cornell'S is capable of such feats. But Edward is skeptical of such claims, thematic and suitable for the agnostic. Father Cornell'S finishes his sermon, and though Rose doesn't directly say it, we can assume she wants Cornell'S to resurrect her boyfriend, but she is swiftly denied. And in this one panel on the bottom right of the 19th page, we understand the kind of person Father Cornell'S is. Even though we never see them, his eyes are cut from the panel, he's enshrouded in darkness. These are basic techniques. It's hard to read faces when we can't see a significant portion of it, making that person appear mysterious and or untrustworthy. And darkness obviously has its own negative connotations. With those two elements, it makes his constant smiling much more sinister. It's never mentioned what Rose's chores are, but the point being is the citizens perform duties for the church with the hopes of being blessed by Leto's miracles. Alright. Father Cornell'S certainly understands this power dynamic. Rose walks into a church, greeting the Elric brothers. An immediate clash of ideologies begins, starting off with lighthearted humor, but suddenly Edward directs the conversation to a much more serious tone that may appear a bit rude considering what he knows of her situation. I believe he's attempting to cut to the chase though. Does Rose believe that Father Cornell'S is capable of bringing her boyfriend back to life? Despite her being rejected earlier, she answers without hesitation. If it hadn't been clear earlier, Father Cornell'S has a very tight grip on his followers. Edward proceeds to list ingredients that make up the average adult body, yet he notes modern science is still unable to create life. He also comments how cheap human bodies are. Rose chastises him, but Edward laughs it off. He equates alchemists with scientists. He states he doesn't value concepts that can't be proven, but sees the irony in attempting to understand the natural world, which many consider God's creation, thus bringing him closer to God. Rose is noticeably frustrated, questioning if Edward believes he is God's equal. Edward responds with a story of a hero that is a clear reference to the Greek myth of Icarus. What I appreciate about this conversation is that by this point we have been given context for that earlier scene. Edward and Alphonse had attempted to bring someone back to life, attempting to play God, and had clearly failed. The clues are there. On that first page we see the chalk symbol on the ground. Edward has a book of a recipe for a human body, knows the cost of the ingredients, seems to know a lot about the research done in human transmutation, and even equates himself to Icarus. There is more understanding for Edward's boorish attitude at the beginning of the conversation. Without admitting what he had done, he's attempting to tell Rose that he's been in her shoes and this is not going to work out the way she desires. We witness one of Father Cornell'S miracles for the first time. The Elric brothers take issue with this. They observe that it appears to be like alchemy, but has broken the laws. And coincidentally and conveniently, Rose bumps into them again. Alphonse gives Rose, and by extension us, a comprehensive summary of alchemy, but TLDR, the major factor here is equivalent exchange. For example, earlier Alphonse could only use those parts to repair the radio. He couldn't use it would be impossible for him to transmute those parts into, let's say, a car, right? How this translates to the situation at hand is that Father Cornell'S How this relates to the situation at hand is that Father Cornell'S should not be able to transmute something into something else with greater mass. Rose rationalizes that this is undoubtedly the work of divine miracles. At this point, we are given the motivation for the Elric brothers' visit to town. Attention is given to Cornell'S ring, and Edward believes this is the source of his miracles. Edward uses Rose to gain an audience with Father Cornell'S in a rather unconvincing and silly manner, not as if that affects Rose's decision, but it should. I mean, they did argue that whole time at the church, so, you know, him feigning this newfound religious side of him is kind of ridiculous. Cornell'S and one of his thugs discuss the Elric brothers, and we continue to see the fame of the Fullmetal Alchemist is well known within this town. Our knowledge of alchemy is again expanded as we learn that age does not play a part or a factor in terms of the ability of the alchemist. Father Cornell'S and his lackey express concern that the government is snooping around to investigate the church's intentions. We get our first look at Cornell'S eyes, as if to signal that his true nature has been revealed, commanding his follower to kill the brothers. It doesn't take long for the action to start here, by the way. The thug pulls out a gun and shoots Alphonse's head right off at point-blank range. Edward is apprehended by two men. Rose is obviously bewildered by their actions, and she gives us the man's name right there, Cray. He assures us that the Elric brothers are evil, and he is acting on Father Cornell'S orders. But their assailants are easily thwarted as the Headless Armor and Edward beat their assailants. Let's pause here because there's a lot to speak about. Beginning with Cray. This is more of how I would have preferred they handled this situation. So he decides to shoot Alphonse first, which I kind of take issue with. Now, it can be argued the armor makes Alphonse appear more physically intimidating, but he had just discussed with Father Cornell'S the danger Edward presents despite his appearance. It's unfortunate because if you remove the dialogue when Cray clearly describes Edward, if the only information he's working with is that they are the Elric brothers and the oldest is the Fullmetal Alchemist, this decision makes more sense under those conditions as we've seen previously, and it would have been a great way to connect that small joke earlier with the townspeople and his decision to go after Alphonse first, just based on assumptions. It's a small gripe I have, to be fair. Ultimately, he would have shot them both within seconds of each other, but it would have been a way different scenario had he shot Edward first. Let's just keep that in mind. And it's not as if, he could predict what came next. I think Alphonse's empty armor reveal is done especially well in this panel, where we can clearly see nothing is inside. There are a few clues that something was off about him. We are never shown what he looks like, even at the beginning. He appears to be a bit clumsy in his big armor, and he's supposedly the younger brother, but he is considerably taller than Edward. Not a big fan of the use of humor here, not speaking about the helmet throw itself, as I'd imagine it would make a great projectile weapon, if albeit a tad silly. Earlier uses of comedy were fine. There were no dangerous situations to navigate. The events as they are here, starting in mortal danger, then start to goof off a bit. Now the tone turns serious again as Rose is shocked by these events, and Edward alludes to their past failure. He also points out Cornell'S actions, like he tried to murder him. But Rose refuses to acknowledge it in another comedically drawn panel before the main confrontation begins. I wouldn't say it's bad comedy, or that someone shouldn't find it funny. I would, however, argue it was inappropriate in the context they were used in. Humor alleviates tension. It can be used to set a light-hearted tone. Okay? Hypothetically, let's say this guy was a robber running away from a shop he just stole from, and Edward uses Alphonse's helmet to incapacitate him. And then he cuts to this panel, and, well, the threat was petty theft, and the matter is already resolved, so the use of humor doesn't impair any drama. Contrast that with this situation, and I'd ask you why you would want to alleviate tension in this situation. Their lives were in danger, Alphonse's secret was exposed, Rose's faith is tested. These elements are treated seriously, so why sandwich humor in between these points? One could argue that the brothers don't take the situation seriously because they're used to being in dangerous situations, right? Okay. However, that will deflate any drama or any threat that the enemy presents, that at least that I would argue. But if it were to be argued that throughout the entirety of the series that no life-threatening situation is ever taken with any degree of seriousness, then I'd have to concede that at the very least this is consistent characterization. This is only the first chapter, so certainly that can't be determined at this point. I also thought it was worth mentioning that I don't think it's impossible to mix comedy and drama, only that it wasn't executed well in this particular section, in this particular chapter. The Elric brothers make their way through the building to confront Father Cornello without Rose, which may seem odd due to Edward's line in a previous panel, where it sounds like he's speaking to her. Father Cornello welcomes them and feigns ignorance, claiming his miracles are not the work of alchemy. Edward speculates that this ring is the Philosopher'S Stone, thus allowing him to break the alchemic laws. Father Cornello finally drops all pretenses and implies the government wants his stone, but from some of the phrasing Edward uses here and before suggests he wants it for his own benefit. Edward rightly points out if Cornello wanted to, he could generate all the money he would ever need, but the father reasons that the monetary gain through church donations is sufficient enough. His real aim is to create a religious army to take over the nation. Again, I really don't care for this goofy exchange for reasons I've already explained in that previous panel. My guess here was that the author was attempting to use meta humor here to set up a stereotypical villain and knock on the trope by having Edward be so dismissive. I'd argue if you notice such a simplistic trope, then why not expand on it to create a more nuanced character? Especially since everything that has happened and all the characters' decisions revolve around this guy. A man that can influence a whole town into following him, offering them their wealth and their bodies to further his cause, sounds like what should be a threatening antagonist, despite if it's been done before. I'm also not a fan of the dismissiveness of the humor here. For example, Father Cornello is going to continue to act as a menacing threat on the same page and pretend like we didn't see him acting like a silly goofball. A line I did find useful from Edward confirms that he has his own goals and is not much of a patriot. He offers to keep Cornello's secret as long as he hands over the stone. Edward's bluntness is a trait I can appreciate in a shonen protagonist. I find good pacing difficult to define because it'll vary widely on the story that's being told, so I'll just use an example, alright? I imagine all, if not most people, have been in a conversation in which you wanted to ask something or address a subject, but you needed to get the typical small talk out of the way. Hi, how are you? How's the family? Etc., right? Pleasantries and conversations are often cut short by Edward because he just wants the information he needs, and by virtue of that, the reader gets the information they need. Now, that isn't to say he doesn't have his more subtle moments, but even then it's by his own design. I mentioned shonen, and it's a very loose genre definition. It just means marketed towards teen boys, often with hot-headed lead characters with tragic pasts, some sort of magic system. Usually the villains are adults or authorities who misuse their power. With Edward, it seems to be taking what would be a stereotypical villain and using it to their advantage of the story, right? Which contrasts with Cornello. Let's continue. Father Cornello mocks Edward's proposal and even his own followers, but Edward's plan is revealed as they stored Rose inside Alphonse'S armor, which I found to be a clever use of something that they had just established, and also makes sense of Edward's line earlier. Rose confronts Father Cornello and asking him if he lied about bringing her boyfriend back from the dead. This opens up an opportunity for Cornello to manipulate her. The Elric brothers warn her to not accept his offer, but it's all in vain because Rose chooses to side with Cornello, rationalizing that it's the only choice she could make. Through the use of the Philosopher'S Stone, the father was able to fuse animals together. And another creative use, Fullmetal Alchemist takes another influence from Greek mythology when the Chimera is introduced. We witness Edward's first use of alchemy this chapter. He claps his hands together, then creates a spear from the ground. But of course, this is contrary to how Alphonse had performed alchemy. Father Cornello's transmutations can be assumed to be caused by his stone ring. Cornello himself immediately recognizes this as an impressive feat, the fact that he could just clap and summon his alchemy. and it gives us the idea that this is uncommon. Now, creating a weapon from your surroundings is certainly resourceful, though this does present an issue. Back when the Elric brothers had demonstrated their hand-to-hand combat skills, it can also be seen that guns exist in this world. Edward evidently doesn't mind using lethal force. He wasn't going to tickle that Chimera with that spear. I would guess that if anyone were facing down a beast like this, the number one thing they would want is as much distance away as possible. I thought Edward's government role would present an opportunity to get his hands on a firearm. Now, alchemy presents a unique situation here. Let's say he wants to infiltrate an enemy compound, and he doesn't want to advertise his weapon. He could easily break or transmute the weapon into pieces, and when he expects to use it, transmute it back. And we know this is possible because both the brothers demonstrate that the complexity of the object doesn't matter. I think it's worth mentioning, we don't know yet if, as a state alchemist, the government would expect Edward to participate in combat. We don't even really know if they would issue him a handgun or what this position entails, honestly. But we can grab context from Father Cornell'S dialogue that he certainly believes Edward presents an immediate danger to him. Now, another issue I would have is that Alphonse didn't take the lead on this physical confrontation, since at this point we haven't been presented with any weaknesses his armor body might have. The Chimera easily slices right through his spear and appears to injure Edward's leg. But it doesn't seem to be, he at least doesn't seem to be fazed by this. He used the same leg to kick the Chimera, in the process revealing his metal prosthetic. Now, I will give some kudos to this fight. Edward was missing his left leg on that first page, and he does lead with his left leg sticking forward in that fight. But with how big that swipe was, he got lucky that the thing didn't aim at his head or his stomach. And next, the Chimera lunges at Edward, and to be fair here, he knowingly places his right arm in front of the beast's mouth. And to the shock of the Chimera and us, he's unable to rip through Edward's arm. We learn Edward's arm is also a prosthetic. His next line here reveals that he and his brother undoubtedly attempted to use alchemy to resurrect someone. The chapter ends with Edward's nickname and the namesake of the series being revealed, and in a meta sense, we understand why the battle was done this way. Arakawa wants to end this battle with this revelation, but I would say that doesn't really excuse sacrificing character competency. Now, the Chimera could have just been revealed and then lunged at Edward before Alphonse could have acted as a shield, blocking, putting his body in between the Chimera and Edward, and also not giving Edward, even with just his clap, not enough time to perform the alchemy. So just straight up lunge at him. This would have forced Edward to defend himself using his automail prosthetics, and in the ensuing scuffle, his clothes could have been torn off, and we still have that reveal of his arm and his leg. So I think it could have been done slightly better than how it was handled. So for the first chapter, I think that Arakawa nailed what needed to be established. We understand the personality and goal of our main character. We understand the world's magic system. We understand the Elric's backstory. Even if we're missing a few details, in most circumstances, I believe these are basic things you want to establish to entice the reader. Who is this person? What's their history? What do they want? I think what lifts this material above average is how the chapter requires us to recall earlier events or perhaps pick up details when rereading. Alphonse's absence and appearance, the chalk symbols, or lack thereof, Edward's missing leg, miracles versus alchemy, the dangers of human transmutation. She really does get a lot of use out of that first panel. Otherwise, it's a fairly simple story. Villain manipulates townspeople, hero exposes and defeats him. I think why this matters is because it increases reader engagement by having us have to work just a little bit to get a better understanding of the world and characters. Should be clarified that it could definitely be, there could definitely, absolutely be a degree of obfuscation that would go too far for most people. But I don't think it's asking too much to connect the dots between an earlier scene and the one you're currently reading. The weaknesses, as I've mentioned, are the uses of humor, as well as Edward's use of alchemy throughout combat leaves a lot to be desired. Unless they're going to reveal he's a superhuman, or his entire body is made out of the same material as his leg and arm, then I think you would want more than a sharp stick between you and this monstrosity. I certainly can't say these flaws should deter from continuing the series, though there's still intriguing elements there. There's still intriguing threads to follow. We obviously have the immediate conflict, but what happened during that experiment? What about Edward's arm? Alphonse's body? We know Edward wants the Philosopher'S Stone, but what are his intentions to do with it? We're only one chapter in, and you could honestly pick any number of elements to be invested in: world building, alchemy, characters, plot. But this is goodbye for now, and thank you for watching.